She stood in the doorway of the living room and saw everything. Conrad Voss, the most powerful man in Boston, sat on the sofa she had personally chosen. Beside him, another woman leaned against his shoulder, legs curled up on the cushion, wearing his shirt, holding a glass of wine. The woman noticed Tessa first. She didn't stand. She didn't flinch. She simply set the glass down and looked at Tessa with the calm gaze of someone who believed she was exactly where she belonged. But it wasn't the woman that made Tessa freeze. It was the bracelet on her wrist. A thin silver band. Simple. Worth almost nothing. Tessa had bought it with her waitress wages before Conrad. Before any of this. It was the first gift she ever gave him. The only one not bought with his money. And now it was on someone else's wrist. Conrad looked up. His expression didn't change. He didn't stand. He didn't move away. "You're home early," he said, his voice flat as a closing door. 30 minutes later, Tessa walked out of the most powerful man in Boston's mansion. One bag, one old photograph, and exactly $4,700 in an account no one knew she had. No car, no phone, no one waiting outside the gate. Conrad stood in the hallway watching the door close. He turned to Celeste, voice perfectly steady. "She knows her place. Tomorrow morning she'll be in the kitchen making coffee like always." But tomorrow morning, Tessa didn't come back. And the morning after that, she didn't either. He had no idea that the woman who just walked into the rain, the girl he called the waitress, would bring half his empire to its knees. Not with guns, not with violence, but with something he never imagined she had. And by the time he realized who she truly was, it was already far too late. If you want to know what a waitress did to bring Boston's most powerful man to his knees, like this video right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss a single story. But to understand why that night changed everything, we have to go back a few hours. Back to the moment when Conrad Voss was still the man who held everything in his hands and believed it would always stay that way. That afternoon, in a private closed restaurant in Back Bay, Conrad sat at the head of a long table with representatives from 3 allied families. The meeting had gone on for nearly 2 hours. There was only one subject: the division of the northern shipping route, the richest route, the one all 4 families wanted to control. Both sides had already begun raising their voices. The Whitmore family slammed a hand on the table and said they wouldn't accept an even split because they'd invested more. The Brennan family fired back, saying that investing more didn't mean having more rights. The air in the room thickened like the stillness before a storm. Conrad said nothing during those 2 hours. He sat still, both hands resting on the table, listening to every sentence, watching every pair of eyes. Anyone who didn't know him would have thought he didn't care. Anyone who did know him understood that when Conrad Voss went silent, that was when he was most dangerous. When the argument reached its peak, he placed his hand on the tabletop, gently, and said, "Are you finished?" The room went silent. He laid out his proposal in 3 minutes. Divide it by territory, by operational capacity, by existing relationships with the port. No favoritism. No one got everything, but everyone got enough. And most important of all, the plan was right. So right that no one could find a flaw to object to. No one objected. As they were leaving, a younger boss asked his lieutenant, "Is he always like that?" The lieutenant watched Conrad walk toward the door and said, "He's never needed to raise his voice. That's the problem." That was Conrad Voss, 33 years old, controlling a chain of high-end restaurants, 2 hotels, a shipping company in the light, and an underground network spread across Boston in the dark. He didn't rule by fear. He ruled through the certainty that he was always right. And for 15 years, he almost always was. Almost. 5 years earlier, Conrad was inspecting a newly opened restaurant in his chain when he happened to pass by the kitchen after the rush hour crowd had died down. He saw the restaurant manager cornering a waitress, forcing her to work an unpaid extra shift, threatening to fire her when she refused. Conrad fired the manager on the spot. Then he turned and looked at the girl standing in the corner of the kitchen, her back straight, her eyes unafraid. She looked straight into his eyes and said, "Thank you, but I don't need anyone to save me. I just need someone to pay me on time." That was the first time in his life anyone had looked Conrad Voss directly in the eyes without lowering their head. He was drawn to her at once. But he called that pull possession instead of respect. And the mistake began in that very moment. Tessa Marlowe, 22 years old when they met. Fatherless, Her mother had died of illness when Tessa was 19. Medical debts piled up around her. She waited tables, washed dishes, cleaned hotel rooms. Conrad kept her close, gave her a job managing internal restaurant operations, and little by little, she became the person running the entire legal side of the Voss empire. No official title, no one called her a partner. She was only Conrad Voss's woman. But everything passed through her hands. That night, after the family meeting, Conrad returned to the mansion. Tessa was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open, the restaurant ledgers spread out in front of her. She looked up when he walked in. The wine supplier called. Next week's order has to be confirmed before Friday. I handled it. Conrad nodded, walked past her. Didn't stop, didn't ask what she was doing, didn't ask whether she was tired. He went straight upstairs, because in his mind, Tessa sitting there handling work at 10 o'clock at night was normal, like the coffee machine turning itself on every morning, like the lights coming on by themselves when darkness fell, something that was always there, something that didn't need to be asked about, didn't need to be thanked. That was their life. Conrad controlled the empire. Tessa kept everything running. He never stopped long enough to realize those two jobs carried equal weight, and that if one of them stopped, the other wouldn't be able to stand. A few hours later, Tessa would be standing at the living room door and seeing everything. But for now, she was still sitting in the kitchen, alone, working for the empire of the man who had just walked past her without saying a word. Tessa didn't know how long she stood in the living room doorway. Maybe 3 seconds, maybe 30. Time became something thick and slow as she looked at the silver bracelet on the other woman's wrist. A thin, simple bracelet, bought with waitress wages back when Tessa worked 12-hour shifts every day and ate instant noodles every night. She had given it to Conrad on his first birthday after they got together. He had looked at the bracelet, smiled faintly, said, "Beautiful," then put it in a desk drawer. She never saw him wear it, but she had also never imagined he would give it to someone else. Conrad looked at Tessa from the sofa. He didn't stand up. He didn't move away from Celeste. And when he opened his mouth, his voice didn't sound like that of a man who had just been caught. It was level, patient, as if he were explaining something obvious to someone who simply didn't understand. "Don't make this bigger than it is, Tessa. You're smart. You know how things work." He leaned back into the sofa, his eyes fixed on her without blinking. "You have a good life here. It's been 5 years. Everything you have, this house, the work, the safety, all of it is because of me. You were waiting tables when I found you. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true, and we both know it." Celeste sat still. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence on that sofa, in that shirt, with that bracelet on her wrist, had already said enough. The room was very quiet. There was only the sound of rain outside the windows, and the low music coming from the speaker on the bookshelf. Tessa looked at Conrad. Her face wasn't empty. Empty means vacant. Her face was full, so full that no one could read what it was holding inside. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She just looked at him a little longer, as if she were memorizing that face one last time. Then she turned and walked down the hall. Conrad didn't follow her. He sat still on the sofa and watched her go, because in his mind, this was a passing anger. Tessa would go into the bedroom, close the door, maybe cry for a while, and by morning everything would return to normal. She had no other choice. She needed him. He believed that completely, deep in his bones, without a trace of doubt. That arrogance was why he didn't call security. Tessa went into the bedroom. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She switched on the small table lamp, its yellow glow just bright enough for her to see what she needed. She opened the closet and didn't look at the expensive dresses, the shoes she had never bought for herself. She took the old handbag from the highest shelf, the bag she had carried before she ever stepped into this world. She put into it the things that belonged to her, only the things that belonged to her, nothing more. 10 minutes. She only needed 10 minutes. Then she walked out. She crossed the hallway, past the living room where Conrad and Celeste were still sitting. They both watched her. She stopped at the table beside the front door, where the keys and everyday things were kept. She set each item down one by one, gently, precisely, without rushing. Credit card, house key, car key. Each thing touched the wooden surface with a small knock in the silent room. Every little knock was like a sentence she didn't need to speak. When she was done, she slipped her hand into her coat pocket, checked the personal debit card, the only thing Conrad didn't know she had, then picked up the handbag. She knew how to leave the mansion without anyone noticing, because she was the one who arranged everything in this house, from the security shifts to the equipment maintenance schedule, from each person's work hours to every overlooked blind spot. She knew which way to leave tonight, at what hour, and no one would ask. She opened the front door. Rain struck her face. Cold. Heavy. Conrad stood up. He stood at the head of the hallway, not stepping closer, but his voice changed. Not regret. Not yet. But something uncertain was inside it. Something she had almost never heard from him. Tessa, you can't go out right now. Not in this rain. Stop. We'll talk. She didn't turn back. She stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind her. The sound of the closing door was not loud, not soft, just enough. But in that vast, quiet house, it echoed for a very long time. Conrad stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door. Behind him, Celeste rose in the living room, and he heard the sound of a wine bottle being set down on the table. He looked at the door for a few more seconds. Then he turned back, sat down, and picked up his glass. He believed she would come back. He was certain of it. Certain the way he was certain the sun would rise, because in Conrad Voss's world, no one left. No one refused what he gave, and certainly no one, especially not a waitress from Boston with no family, no degree, and nothing but an old handbag, would dare walk out of his life forever. But Conrad Voss had never understood Tessa Marlowe, and the greatest mistake of his life wasn't the night he let Celeste sit on that sofa. The greatest mistake was the 5 years he had sat across from Tessa every night and not once truly seen her. Tessa walked in the rain for nearly 40 minutes before she managed to call a taxi from the prepaid phone she had bought separately several months earlier. The cheap phone, with nothing on it except calling and texting, lay in the smallest pocket of the handbag she carried with her. She hadn't bought it because she had planned to leave. She bought it because she had lived long enough in Conrad Voss's world to understand that a person without a private way out wasn't truly free. The taxi driver looked at her through the rearview mirror, a soaked woman sitting in the back seat clutching an old handbag, and asked where she wanted to go. Tessa gave him the name of a street in the southern suburbs of Boston, where she remembered seeing a small motel once, back when she had gone to inspect a seafood supplier for the Voss restaurant chain more than a year earlier. At the time, she had only glanced at the flickering neon sign before driving on. She had never imagined that one day she would come back here as a guest. The motel room was small, the fluorescent light flickering, the mattress thin, the sheets smelling of industrial detergent. Tessa set her handbag on the bed, opened it, and took out the small photograph that had followed her through the past 5 years. A photograph of her mother, taken in the backyard of the shabby rental house where the two of them had once lived, back when her mother had still been healthy enough to stand and smile into the camera. Tessa placed the photograph on the nightstand, leaning it against the bedside lamp. She looked at her mother's picture for a long time. She said nothing. There are moments when looking is enough. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and opened her laptop. The screen lit up in the dark room. She opened the banking app and logged into her personal account, the account Conrad didn't know existed. The balance appeared, $4,700. Money she had saved from restaurant management commissions and year-end bonuses. Small amounts transferred over the course of 5 years. Not $1 came from underground money. Not $1 was anything she hadn't earned herself. She calculated quickly in her head. The motel room was $65 a night. Food, at the bare minimum, $15 a day. The prepaid phone, transportation, unforeseen expenses. She had about 2 months, maybe less. 2 months to turn everything she had quietly prepared for 2 years into reality, or to go back to the starting line, washing dishes, waiting tables, beginning again from the very bottom for the 3rd time in her life. She closed the banking app, opened a folder on her laptop. Inside was a single file, 47 pages. The business plan she had been writing for the past 2 years, night after night, at the kitchen table in the Voss mansion, after Conrad had gone to sleep and the house had sunk into silence. 2 years of sitting there in the depth of night, finishing the books for his empire while building something of her own. 1 page at a time, 1 number at a time, 1 night at a time. She opened the file and read it again from the beginning, slowly, carefully, like someone inspecting a weapon before battle. She corrected 3 places, numbers that needed updating, a section of analysis that needed to be rewritten more precisely. Saved, closed the laptop. She lay down on the motel bed and stared up at the ceiling, where a damp stain spread in one corner. Outside, the rain was still falling. Now and then, a car passed on the road, its headlights sweeping across the window before vanishing. The room went dark again, quiet again. Tomorrow begins, she thought. Not as hope, not as prayer, just as fact. Tomorrow, she would wake up in this room, with no one, no safety net, no one's name to lean on, and she would begin, just as she had begun at 19, when her mother died and she stood alone before a pile of medical debt higher than anything she had ever known. Just as she had begun every morning after that, waking up, going to work, asking no one, begging no one, just doing what had to be done. She didn't sleep that night, but Tessa Marlowe didn't need sleep. She needed a plan, and the plan she had, 47 pages, resting inside the laptop on the nightstand, right beside her mother's photograph. The two things she had carried with her when she walked out of the empire of the most powerful boss in Boston. One was the past, one was the future, and both of them belonged entirely to her. The next morning, Conrad came down to the kitchen at 7 o'clock, the way he did every day. The first thing he noticed was that the coffee machine hadn't been turned on. For the past 5 years, every morning when Conrad stepped into the kitchen, the machine had already been running. The coffee had already been ready. The cup had already been placed exactly where it belonged. He had never turned on the coffee machine himself. Not once. He stood in front of the cold machine, looking at it as if he were looking at a strange object, then ignored it. He took out his phone and called Tessa. The phone rang 4 times, then cut off. He called again. Cut off. He called a 3rd time. Same result. He set the phone down on the kitchen table, not in a hurry, because in his mind, there still wasn't any room for the possibility that Tessa had truly left. She was angry. She was turning off her phone to apply pressure. She would call back before noon. He believed that the way he believed the sun would rise every morning, because in 33 years of life, Conrad Voss had never lost anything he hadn't chosen to let go. He told Mrs. Martha to go upstairs and check Tessa's room. Mrs. Martha had been in this mansion for 12 years, since Conrad's father was still alive. She knew every corner, every drawer, every habit of every person under this roof. She went upstairs, entered Tessa's room, then came back down 10 minutes later with a face Conrad couldn't read. She stood in the kitchen doorway and said, her voice neither rising nor falling, only flat, as if she were reading a report. The closet is still full. The shoes are still there. The jewelry is still untouched in its boxes. She paused. She didn't take anything you bought for her. Conrad looked at Mrs. Martha. That sentence should have made him understand something. A person who left without taking anything was a person who didn't want to owe. It meant they were cutting ties, cleanly, completely. But Conrad didn't hear that meaning. He heard this. She hadn't even taken clothes, which meant she would have to come back for them. He said, call Briggs. Tell him to check which hotel she's staying at. She's probably somewhere nearby, waiting to cool down before she comes home. Mrs. Martha looked at him for a little longer, then turned away to call Briggs. She said nothing more, but the way she turned, a little slower than usual, a little heavier than usual, made it seem as if she were carrying something she didn't want to set down in front of him right then. Briggs searched carefully. Tessa's phone had been turned off since the night before and hadn't come back on. Her credit card was lying on the table by the front door, unused. There were no transactions, no trace, not one signal showing where she was. Tessa Marlowe disappeared from the system, as if she had never existed inside it at all, and then the system began to show just how deeply she had existed inside it. On the 3rd day, the seafood supplier called to ask why that week's order hadn't been confirmed. No one in the mansion knew the supplier's phone number. No one knew how much was usually ordered, where it was delivered, or what payment cycle they used. Tessa handled all of it. Tessa knew all of it. And Tessa wasn't here anymore. On the 5th day, the flagship restaurant was hit with a food safety inspection. Normally, Tessa was the one who kept all the legal paperwork, maintained relationships with the authorities, and tracked the regular inspection schedule. She knew who needed to be called, which documents needed to be prepared, which procedures had to be followed. Without her, the restaurant staff ran in circles like ants after their nest had been destroyed. The inspection ended with a list of violations longer than any they had ever received before. On the 7th day, 2 cornerstone managers in the restaurant chain submitted their resignations. They didn't submit them to Conrad. They submitted them to Mrs. Martha, because throughout their time there, they had never reported directly to Conrad. They worked with Tessa. They were loyal to Tessa, and when Tessa was gone, they found no reason to stay. In the middle of all that, Celeste Hargrove began appearing, at first, for a reasonable reason, to discuss the business alliance between the Hargrove family and the Voss family. One afternoon, then one dinner, then one night. Then Celeste stayed, naturally, with no one inviting her and no one asking her to leave, as if she were filling the space Tessa had left behind. Conrad didn't object, maybe because he needed someone beside him, maybe because he wanted to prove that Tessa wasn't that important. Maybe both. Celeste saw the system beginning to sway and decided she could fix it. She was used to running things through orders, used to issuing instructions and expecting others to obey. In the second week, she fired the head chef, the man who had been with the restaurant for 8 years, because he wasn't following the new procedure she had invented without asking anyone. The head chef said nothing. He took off his apron, folded it, placed it on the kitchen counter, then walked out the door. 3 kitchen employees followed him, without a word from anyone. Conrad heard the news but didn't intervene. He was busy handling calls from partners, from suppliers, from lawyers, from people he had never once needed to speak to directly because Tessa had always been the one standing in between, the bridge, the buffer between him and an entire complicated operating system he had never bothered to understand. The mansion and the restaurant chain didn't collapse immediately. No one set off a bomb. No one sabotaged anything. It was simply that the person who had kept everything running had left, and everything began to slow down, then fall out of rhythm, then stumble, then fall. Like a clock that had lost the smallest gear inside it, the gear no one saw, no one thought about, until the hour hand began pointing to the wrong time. Mrs. Martha knocked on Conrad's study door one afternoon, about 2 weeks after Tessa left. Conrad was sitting behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, talking to someone about a delayed supply contract. He signaled for Mrs. Martha to wait. She stood in the doorway, both hands folded in front of her stomach, waiting. She had waited for many things during her 12 years working in this house. Waited for Conrad's father to pass away. Waited for Conrad to take over. Waited for Tessa to walk in and turn this cold mansion into a place that carried the warmth of human breath. And now she was waiting to say the thing she had kept inside her for the past 2 weeks, perhaps longer than that, perhaps since the night she went upstairs to check Tessa's room and saw that the closet was still full. Conrad ended the call and set the phone down. "What is it, Mrs. Martha?" Mrs. Martha stepped into the room. She didn't sit down. She stood in front of Conrad's desk, her back straight, and looked at him with a gaze he had never seen from her in 12 years. It wasn't the gaze of a housekeeper looking at the master of the house. It was the gaze of an older person looking at a child who had just ruined something precious without understanding what it was. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I've been in this house for 12 years. I served your father. Then I served you. I've never said anything beyond my place. But today, I need you to hear one thing." Conrad looked at her. He didn't interrupt, not because of respect, but because there was something in Mrs. Martha's voice that made him understand this wasn't a conversation he could control by speaking less than the other person. "Miss Tessa never gave orders to anyone in this house." Mrs. Martha spoke, each word clear, as if she were placing stones one by one onto the desk. She remembered the names of every child of every person who works here, every single one. The head chef has chronic back pain. She knew that, so she rearranged his shifts so he wouldn't have to stand through the evening shift back to back. No one asked her. She noticed it herself, and she did it herself. She paused. "I'm diabetic," she knew. She kept my medicine ready for me in the kitchen drawer, the 3rd drawer on the left, beside the tea box. Every month, she checked whether I had enough or was running low. Never said a word, just did it. Conrad sat still. "She didn't manage this house, Mr. Voss." Mrs. Martha said it, and her voice didn't tremble, but there was something heavy underneath it. The heaviness of someone speaking a truth they knew wouldn't be heard. She held this house together. Then Mrs. Martha did something she had never done in 12 years. She placed a sheet of paper on Conrad's desk, her resignation letter, written by hand, brief, with small, even handwriting. "Not because I'm angry with you," she said, "but because this house isn't a home anymore." Conrad looked at the letter, looked at the handwriting of Mrs. Martha, The woman who had been here since before he ever sat in this chair. The woman who had made coffee for his father every morning. The woman who had stood in the hallway on the day of his father's funeral and hadn't cried because she knew no one in this house was allowed to cry. That person was placing her resignation letter in front of him. Not because of salary, not because she was tired, not because of old age, but because this house was no longer a home. Mrs. Martha turned and walked out of the room. Her steps were steady, slow, unhurried. The sound of her footsteps echoed across the wooden floor in the hallway, then faded, then disappeared. Conrad sat alone in the study. The phone on the desk vibrated. Some call. Some problem in the restaurant chain that needed handling. Some hole in the system Tessa had left behind. He didn't pick it up. He looked at the letter on the desk. Didn't lift it. Didn't tear it up. Didn't fold it and put it away. Just looked. In 15 years of holding power, Conrad Voss had lost many things. Lost partners, lost deals, lost money, even lost people who had once stood beside him and then turned their backs because of profit or fear. But those things were lost because of the game, because of the battlefield, because of the rules of the world he had chosen to live in. He knew how to handle them. He knew how not to feel. But Mrs. Martha wasn't a partner, wasn't a pawn, wasn't someone he could replace with a phone call. She was the person who had been here before him, who had witnessed everything, who had stayed silent for 12 years, and she chose to leave, not because someone had betrayed her, but because the thing she had been loyal to, the thing that Waitress had built over 5 years through small actions no one saw, had vanished along with Tessa. Conrad sat in the study for a very long time that afternoon. The letter lay on the desk in front of him, white, quiet, and heavier than any document he had ever read. Briggs didn't call. He came in person, in the evening, when Conrad was sitting in his study with his third glass of liquor and a long list of unanswered calls on his phone. Briggs knocked, stepped inside, didn't greet him, didn't ask how he was. He placed a thin file on Conrad's desk, right beside the glass, then sat down in the chair across from him and said nothing. Briggs was that kind of man. After 10 years as Conrad's right hand, in charge of security and internal intelligence, he had learned that sometimes the best way to say something important was to say nothing at all, to simply lay the truth on the table and let the other man read it for himself. Conrad looked at the file. Thin, no more than 10 pages, a plain cover with no label. "Where is she?" he asked. Briggs shook his head. "Haven't found her. Her phone's been off since that night. She hasn't used any credit cards. She hasn't shown up at any hotel in the system we can monitor. She disappeared clean." Conrad frowned. "A waitress doesn't disappear clean, Briggs. She isn't an agent." Briggs looked at him, holding his gaze longer than usual, then said, "Open the file." Conrad opened it. Inside were the results of the investigation Briggs had been running for the past 2 weeks, not to find Tessa's location, but to find out who Tessa truly was. And what lay inside didn't look like anything Conrad had ever believed about the woman who had lived beside him for 5 years. Tessa Marlowe, throughout her 5 years at the Voss mansion, had quietly taught herself business administration, corporate accounting, commercial law, all through online courses, registered under a separate email address no one knew about, completed late at night after she had finished handling the books for the Voss empire. She hadn't studied at Harvard. She didn't have a college degree, but she had knowledge, practical knowledge, built layer by layer by someone who had operated 60% of the Voss Corporation's legal revenue and understood that system, not in theory, but by hand, by sweat, by thousands of small decisions every day. The next page. A personal bank account. Balance, $4,700. Conrad looked at the number, then looked again, because in his mind, Tessa didn't have money of her own. Tessa used the credit card he gave her. Tessa lived in his house, ate the food he bought, drove the car he had gifted her. But $4,700 sat in this account, all of it from bonuses and commissions Conrad had paid her for managing the restaurant chain. Legal money, money she had earned, every single dollar. "She didn't take $1 that wasn't hers," Briggs said, his voice flat. "Didn't touch the underground side. Didn't transfer money from your accounts. Didn't take anything except what she deserved under contract." The final page. Tessa's personal contact list. Suppliers, partners, restaurant managers, chefs, transportation staff, legal representatives for commercial contracts. All of them were relationships she had built herself over 5 years, through her own credibility, through her punctuality, through the way she treated people. They worked with Tessa, not Conrad. They trusted Tessa, not Conrad. And when Tessa left, their loyalty left with her. Briggs added one more sentence, a sentence Conrad would remember for a very long time. The clean side accounts for 60% of the corporation's public revenue. She knows every pipeline in it, because she's the one who installed every pipeline herself. Conrad closed the file, set it back down on the desk. Briggs stood, understanding that he should leave now. He walked to the door, stopped, and looked back at Conrad one more time. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Conrad alone with the thin file and everything it held inside. Conrad sat still for a long time. Then he did something he had never done before. He opened his laptop, entered the restaurant chain's internal email system, the system Tessa managed and he had never bothered to log into, and typed Tessa's name into the search bar. Hundreds of emails appeared, but he didn't read hundreds. He didn't need to, because his eyes stopped on a single email, sent 2 years earlier, with the subject line, Restaurant Expansion Proposal, Analysis. He looked at the status beside it, unread. This email had sat in his inbox for 2 years. 14 pages of detailed analysis Tessa had written, perhaps during those late nights after he had gone to bed, perhaps at that very kitchen table where she sat every evening, and he had never opened it, not once. He didn't even remember receiving it. He moved the cursor toward that email. His hand paused above the keyboard. Then he closed the laptop. Not because he didn't want to read it, but because he was beginning to understand that those 14 pages weren't just a business analysis. They were evidence. Evidence that Tessa had looked at him, had sent him the best thing she had waited for him to open it, had waited for him to see her, and he hadn't opened it for 2 years. Conrad sat in the study as the room slowly darkened with the sunset beyond the window. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't call anyone. He sat there with the closed laptop and Briggs's thin file and the empty glass of liquor. And for the first time in a very long time, Conrad Voss felt something he had no word for. Something lodged behind his breastbone. Heavy and murky. Not like fear, not like anger, but like the faint sound of something breaking, something that had been cracked for a long time and was only now beginning to collapse. While Conrad sat in his darkening study with the closed laptop in front of him, Tessa was standing at the host stand of a restaurant in Dorchester, wearing the only outfit she had been able to buy from a thrift store for $12, her hair tied neatly back, her spine straight, telling the manager that she had 5 years of experience operating a restaurant chain and wanted to apply for a management position. The manager looked at her, looked at the clothes, looked at the job application with no degree listed, then shook his head. "We need someone with a management degree." She thanked him, walked out, and went to the next restaurant. She applied at many places over the course of a week. Most turned her down for the same reason. No formal degree, no paperwork proving her experience beyond her own word. One place accepted her application, scheduled an interview, then called back and canceled at the last minute. The manager stammered over the phone, saying the position had already been filled, but Tessa heard something else in his voice. Hesitation. Caution. Someone had asked about her and discovered she was connected to the Voss name. In Boston's restaurant business, that name carried weight, and not the kind of weight everyone wanted to carry. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to hire the woman who had once walked beside the most powerful boss in the city, then vanished in the night. Too many questions, too few safe answers. In the end, a small restaurant in Jamaica Plain took her in. Not as a manager, as kitchen help. $14 an hour. The owner was a middle-aged man named Hector, a man who didn't ask where she came from, didn't Google her name, only asked whether she could handle a 10-hour shift and whether she knew how to tell coriander from cilantro. Tessa said yes. She started the next day. Her shift began at 6 o'clock in the morning. She chopped vegetables, washed dishes, prepared ingredients, cleaned the kitchen, mopped the floor, carried heavy things, took out the trash. 10 hours. Every day. $14 an hour. That money was enough to pay for the motel room, enough to eat, enough so she wouldn't have to touch the $4,700 in her emergency account. She was keeping that money for something else, for the plan. At night, when her shift ended and she returned to the motel room, Tessa didn't rest. She took a quick shower, changed clothes, sat down at the only small table in the room, opened her laptop, and worked. The 47-page business plan opened every night, revised, updated, expanded. She studied the restaurant market in Boston, analyzed possible locations, compared rental prices, calculated the minimum cost of operating. She reached back out to old suppliers she had worked with during her time managing the Voss restaurant chain, not to ask for help, only to feel things out, to keep the relationship warm, to make sure they remembered her name and remembered that she was someone who kept her word. She slept 4 to 5 hours a night, sometimes less, enough for her body not to collapse, not enough to call it rest. One night, after a 10.5-hour shift, because the restaurant had been busier than usual, Tessa stood at the sink in the kitchen, washing her hands one last time before leaving. Hot water ran over her hands, and she looked down. The skin was dry, cracked, red, stinging from industrial soap and dish detergent, and hours spent soaking in water. Those hands looked exactly like her hands years earlier, when she had first started washing dishes at her first restaurant after her mother died, when she was 19, and had nothing but a mountain of medical debt and the determination not to fall apart. She looked at her hands beneath the running water. They stung, but they could still move. They could still hold a knife. They could still type on a keyboard. They could still write a plan. They could still work. "I did it the first time," she whispered to herself, her voice so small no one heard it except her and the empty sink. "I'll do it this time." She turned off the faucet, dried her hands with the last clean towel on the rack, put on her coat, turned off the kitchen lights, and stepped out through the restaurant's back door. Outside, Boston at night was cold and wide and indifferent to anyone standing at the curb after a 10-hour kitchen shift. Tessa walked beneath the streetlights, toward the motel, toward the waiting laptop, toward the 47 pages of plans she would open tonight, and every night after that until it was no longer a plan on paper, but something real. She didn't know then that a few dozen miles away, in the Voss mansion, Conrad was sitting before a closed laptop with a 14-page email he had never opened, and for the first time in his life, he was wondering whether he had ever truly known the woman who had lived beside him for 5 years. She didn't know, and even if she had known, it wouldn't have changed anything, because Tessa Marlowe didn't build her future on whether someone else saw her. She built it on the fact that she saw herself. Tessa didn't take reckless chances. She never did. People who grow up without a safety net don't have that luxury. Every step has to be calculated, because every wrong step can be the last one. After a few weeks working as kitchen help at Hector's restaurant, once the rhythm of her new life had settled enough that she didn't have to think about food and shelter every day, Tessa began looking into Donovan Mercer. She didn't do it through newspapers or the internet. She did it through people she trusted, old suppliers she had worked with during her time managing the Voss restaurant chain. She called 2 of them, not to ask for help, but to ask questions. Questions about Mercer. Whether he paid on time, whether he kept his word, how he treated the people who worked for him, whether he was the kind of man who used people and threw them away. The answers she received weren't entirely good, and they weren't entirely bad. Donovan Mercer was Conrad's direct rival, controlling southern Boston, ambitious, but not the kind of man who played dirty when he didn't need to. He paid on time. He kept his word once he shook hands. And he wanted to expand into the high-end restaurant business, but he hadn't found someone who understood the industry deeply enough to run it. Tessa listened to all of that, and calculated. For 2 weeks, she calculated. By day, she chopped vegetables and washed dishes. By night, she sat on the motel bed and calculated. She knew the risks clearly. Approaching Conrad's rival wasn't a joke. In Boston's underworld, that move could be seen as betrayal, as choosing a side, as declaring war. But Tessa also knew clearly that she didn't have many options. $4,700 wasn't enough to open a restaurant. 5 years of experience without a degree attached to it wasn't something employers would take seriously. The Voss name clung to her resume like an oil stain no one wanted to touch. She had knowledge, relationships, and the ability to operate. But she needed capital and property. And Donovan Mercer had both. Once she decided, she didn't hesitate anymore. She took the 47-page business plan and pulled out the leanest 20 pages. The market analysis, the operating model, the 3 strategic locations she knew Donovan had his eye on, but hadn't been able to access, and the specific weakness of the competitor at each site. She went to the copy shop near the motel and printed those 20 pages on white paper. $8. She stood at the counter waiting for the pages to come out of the machine, watching each sheet slide through, and thought that these $8 might be the most important $8 of her life, or $8 thrown away. She brought the printout back to the motel, sat on the bed, and read it from beginning to end. Slowly, carefully, one line at a time. On page 14, she found a typo. One wrong word. She corrected it by hand, her pen stroke careful, then kept reading. When she finished, she placed the 20 pages into a large white envelope. Her hand trembled slightly as she folded the envelope flap, not because she was afraid, but because she understood that this was the biggest gamble of her life, bigger than the night she walked out of the Voss mansion. That night she left. Today she began. The next morning, Tessa wore the cleanest outfit she had, the one she had bought for $12 at the thrift store, and took the bus to Donovan Mercer's office building on the south side. She stepped into the lobby, went to the reception desk, and placed the envelope on the counter. "Give this to Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice calm. "The sender is Tessa Marlowe. He'll know the name." The receptionist looked at her, looked at the envelope, then nodded and took it. Tessa said thank you and walked outside. She sat down on the stone bench across from the building and waited. 1 hour, 2 hours. The prepaid phone sat still in her coat pocket. She didn't take it out to check. She sat quietly, watching people pass along the sidewalk, watching traffic, watching sunlight shift across the glass face of the building. 3 hours. She began thinking about her backup plan. If Donovan didn't call, she would return to Hector's restaurant, work as kitchen help for a few more months, save more money, find another way. She always had another way. She had lived her whole life by always having another way. 4 hours later, the phone vibrated. Unknown number. She took a breath and answered. "Miss Marlowe?" A man's voice, deep, unhurried. "Donovan Mercer. I just finished reading what you sent. Are you free this afternoon?" Tessa stood up from the stone bench. "I'm free." The meeting lasted 3 hours. Tessa didn't know this when she walked in, but Donovan Mercer had read those 20 pages twice before calling her. He asked her about every number, every projection, every location. She answered without needing the papers. Everything was in her head, because she had lived with those numbers for 2 years, every night, at the kitchen table in the Voss mansion. At the end of the meeting, Donovan sat back, looked at her, and said, "You didn't come here looking for a job." Tessa looked straight at him. "No, I came here to propose a partnership. I have knowledge, relationships, and the ability to operate. You have capital and property. That isn't begging. That's business." Donovan looked at her for a while longer. Then he nodded, slowly. A nod that wasn't agreement, but recognition. Recognition that the person sitting in front of him wasn't the waitress someone had once called her. This person was something else. And Donovan Mercer, unlike Conrad Voss, knew how to recognize that when it was sitting right in front of him. Briggs called Conrad at 7 o'clock in the morning. His voice was calm, as it always was, but there was something in the rhythm of his breathing between sentences that made Conrad understand this wasn't ordinary news. "I found her," Briggs said. Conrad set down his coffee cup, the coffee he had made himself, because there was no one left to make it for him anymore. "Where?" "She's on the south side, Donovan Mercer's territory." Silence on the line. Not the silence of a lost signal, the kind of silence that happens when a person hears something he understands at once but doesn't want to believe. "Repeat that," Conrad said. Tessa Marlowe met with Donovan Mercer. Not just once. She was in his office for 3 hours yesterday afternoon, and according to my source, this wasn't a social visit. Conrad said nothing for 15 seconds. Briggs counted, because Briggs always counted Conrad's silences. 15 seconds was long. Normally, Conrad reacted in 3. "Prepare the car," Conrad said, and hung up. He didn't call ahead. Conrad Voss didn't call ahead before meeting anyone, because in his world, arriving without warning was a form of power. He went to Donovan Mercer's office building on the south side, stepped into the lobby, gave his name to the receptionist, and sat down in the waiting chair with the bearing of a man who wasn't waiting at all, but allowing others time to prepare. Donovan Mercer appeared 10 minutes later. He stepped out of the elevator with a coffee cup in his hand, walking slowly, his face holding nothing remarkable except the calm of a man who had expected this meeting for a long time. He was 61 years old, gray-haired, the kind of man who had been underestimated enough times in life that he never made the mistake of underestimating anyone else. "Conrad," Donovan said, his voice warm, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "Come up. We'll talk upstairs." They sat in the conference room on the top floor. Donovan poured another cup of coffee and pushed it toward Conrad. Conrad didn't touch it. He looked straight at Donovan and said, without circling around it, "You're touching what belongs to me." Donovan took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and looked at Conrad. "Which thing?" he asked lightly. "You know which thing. Tessa Marlowe. She's mine, and I hear she's been sitting in your office discussing opening restaurants. A model exactly like my chain." Donovan placed both hands on the table, laced his fingers together, and looked at Conrad with a gaze. Conrad wasn't used to receiving the gaze of a man who wasn't impressed at all. "I'm not touching your territory, Conrad," Donovan said, each word clear. "I'm building my territory, with my money, on my properties. And the person helping me build it," he paused, looking straight into Conrad's eyes, "is the person you called not a problem." Conrad froze. Those 3 words, not a problem. That was exactly what he had said during the phone call that night. The call with an ally about the alliance with Celeste. The call he thought no one had heard. "Tessa isn't a problem. She knows her place." He had said those words through the half-open door of his study, and Tessa had been standing on the other side of that door, hearing every word. She had heard all of it. Donovan watched the reaction on Conrad's face. A reaction Conrad rarely allowed anyone to see. And continued, "I'm not surprised to see you here. But you're late, Conrad. Later than you think." "She knows nothing about business at this scale," Conrad said, but his voice had changed, thinner now, less certain, like ice beginning to crack beneath his feet. Donovan leaned forward. "I've met many capable people in 35 years in this business. She isn't the most polished. But she's the only one I've met who understands the system from the root, not because she was formally trained, but because she was forced to learn in order to survive. Do you know that kind of person, Conrad? The kind of person who has already lost everything and isn't afraid to lose anymore. That kind of person never quits, because they don't have that luxury." Conrad sat still, and in that moment, a memory rose in his mind, uninvited. 2 years earlier, one night after he had lost the biggest shipping deal of the year, he sat in his study, saying nothing, calling no one. Tessa walked in, placed a cup of coffee on the desk, sat down in the chair across from him, and said, "The Henderson supplier is in financial trouble. If you sign an exclusive contract with them now, you'll get the lowest purchase rate in the market. Use that margin to offset the deal you just lost." Conrad had done it. The Henderson deal carried him through the crisis. He had never said thank you. In his mind, it was only Tessa doing her job. Now he was sitting here, in his rival's office, listening to that rival speak of the woman he had called not a problem with more respect than anything he had ever said about her in 5 years. Donovan added, his voice softer now, almost like advice. "Conrad, I'm telling you the truth because I respect what you've built. You're a capable man, but you made a mistake many capable people make. You looked at her and saw the waitress you once saved. I looked at her and saw a strategic partner. That difference isn't in her, it's in the eyes of the person looking." Conrad pushed his chair back and stood. He didn't say another word, not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he could say in that moment would make him sound exactly like the man he was beginning to fear he had become, a man standing in someone else's conference room, demanding back something he had never known how to keep. He walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk, cold wind blowing in from the harbor. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had built an empire, signed hundreds of contracts, held control for 15 years. And he thought of another pair of hands, hands dry and cracked from industrial soap, hands that had once made his coffee every morning, hands that had written a 14-page analysis he had never opened, hands that had once placed a silver bracelet on his desk with a note he had never read. He got into the car and told the driver to go. He didn't say where. Just go. Everything began falling apart faster than Conrad had imagined. Like a cracked dam, the first fracture was small, but once the water found a way through, nothing could stop it. The first seafood supplier called on Monday, the man Tessa had worked with for 4 years, the man she called by name, whose wife's birthday she remembered, the man she had always paid on time, not 1 day late. He called the Voss office and said, in an awkward but firm voice, that he wouldn't renew the contract when it expired at the end of the month. He didn't explain much. He only said he had found a new partner who was a better fit. Conrad didn't know who that new partner was, but Briggs knew. And Briggs didn't need to say the name. On Wednesday, the wine supplier called. Same message. No renewal. Thank you for the many years of cooperation. On Friday, the fresh food supplier for all 3 restaurants in the Voss chain announced that they were terminating the contract 2 months early, accepting the penalty for violating the terms. They would rather lose the penalty money than stay. The 3 biggest suppliers, the 3 pillars of the supply chain Tessa had built and maintained for 5 years, left one after another in the same week. Not because anyone forced them, but because the person they trusted was now on the other side. Briggs came to see Conrad on Friday night, after the 3rd supplier announced the contract termination. He stood in the study and didn't sit, because what he was about to say wasn't the kind of news a person delivered while sitting comfortably. There's something else, Briggs said. 4 middle managers in our restaurant system have secretly contacted Tessa, asked whether she needs people. They haven't resigned yet, but they're waiting. Conrad looked at Briggs. How many people will leave if she calls? Briggs was silent for a moment, the kind of silence of a man weighing whether to tell the whole truth or only half of it. Then he chose the truth. About 1/3 of the clean side. Maybe more. Conrad turned his face toward the window. Outside, Boston glowed at night, the city he controlled, the city he believed was his. He said nothing. Briggs waited a few more seconds, then continued, his voice neither rising nor falling. They aren't betraying you, they're just choosing a future. Briggs walked out. Conrad stood alone by the window, and for the first time, he realized that the empire he had spent 15 years building didn't stand firm because of his power. It stood firm because of the loyalty of the people inside it. And that loyalty didn't belong to him. It belonged to a waitress he had called not a problem. That same night, a few dozen miles from the Voss mansion, Tessa was locking the back door of Hector's restaurant. Late shift, almost 11 o'clock at night. The parking lot behind the restaurant was empty, with only one street lamp casting yellow light over the wet asphalt. Tessa finished locking the door, turned around, and saw a man standing beside the dumpster, about 5 steps away from her. She recognized him. Not because his face was familiar, but because of the way he stood, the way he dressed, the way he looked at her, the kind of man who belonged to the Voss system, the kind of man she had seen dozens of times during her 5 years beside Conrad, men standing in hallways, at doors, in corners of rooms, always ready, always loyal, not to a person, but to the organization. Do you know what you're doing? He said, his voice not shouting, but not gentle either. You're destroying your boss. He gave you everything. The house, the work, the life. And now you run over to Mercer's side, pull his people away, cut off his supply lines. Do you know what people in this world call that? Tessa looked at him. She didn't step back. She didn't step forward. She stayed exactly where she was, her hands hanging at her sides, her back straight, just as she had stood in the corner of the restaurant kitchen 5 years earlier when Conrad first met her. Exactly the same. Back straight, eyes unafraid. He didn't give me everything, Tessa said, her voice so calm that the man opposite her had to tilt his head slightly to hear. He gave me work. I did that work and more. I owe no one, and I'm not destroying anyone. I'm just building what's mine. He stepped forward once. Tessa still didn't move. Threaten me then, she said, and her voice didn't tremble, didn't rise, only stayed low and clear. Like she was speaking a truth she had lived with long enough that it no longer had the power to hurt her. When I was 19, I slept on a hospital floor beside my mother for months because I couldn't afford to rent an extra bed. I ate 1 meal a day. I worked 2 shifts back to back because 1 shift wasn't enough to pay the medical debt. My mother died in a bed I had to sign another debt agreement to pay for. You think standing outside the back door of a restaurant at 11 o'clock at night is going to scare me? The man looked at her, said nothing. And in the pale yellow streetlight, Tessa saw something change on his face. Not fear, not pity, recognition. The recognition that threats didn't work on someone who had already stood somewhere deeper than any darkness he could create. He stepped back once. Then he turned and walked into the shadow of the parking lot, his footsteps heavy on the wet asphalt, growing smaller, then disappearing. Tessa stood alone outside the restaurant's back door. Her heart was beating fast, faster than she wanted to admit. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept them hanging straight at her sides until the sound of his footsteps vanished completely. Then she took a long breath, zipped up her coat, and walked toward the motel. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She just walked, step by step, along the cold sidewalk, toward the waiting laptop, and the 47 pages of plans that no one, not Conrad, not Celeste, not any man standing outside a back door at midnight, could take away from her. After the night outside the restaurant's back door, Conrad knew Tessa was out there alone, with no guards, no security system, no one standing between her and anyone who might want to use her as a pawn. In Boston's underworld, everyone knew Tessa had once lived beside Conrad Voss. Everyone knew she knew too much, and everyone knew she was now standing alone, belonging to no side large enough to protect her completely. That was the most dangerous position possible. Conrad called Briggs. "Make a list of every family currently in conflict with us. Who among them knows Tessa left?" Briggs answered, "All of them." Conrad asked, "Who among them is reckless enough to touch her?" Briggs didn't need to think. "Pritchard. He needs the southern shipping route. He's being pressured from several sides, and he's known for playing dirty when he's backed into a corner. If someone is going to use her as leverage, it'll be Pritchard." Conrad said, "Watch Pritchard. Not Tessa. Watch Pritchard. Every movement, every contact, every meeting." Briggs moved immediately that night. But Pritchard was faster. He had been watching Tessa ever since word spread in the underworld that she was working with Donovan Mercer. Pritchard didn't care about Conrad or the old relationship between the two of them. He cared about Donovan, his direct rival in the South, the man who was expanding faster than he had expected. And Tessa, the woman helping Donovan expand, became a target. Tessa disappeared one evening while she was on her way from Hector's restaurant back to the motel. She never made it there. Her prepaid phone shut off at 9:15 that night. No one saw her after that. Briggs found out within 4 hours. He called Conrad at 1 o'clock in the morning, his voice no longer calm the way it usually was. "Pritchard's men took her. I lost track of her in the Western Industrial District. Pritchard has her." Conrad was in his study. He didn't stand up, didn't throw the phone, didn't raise his voice. He sat still for 10 seconds, and Briggs, on the other end of the line, knew those 10 seconds of silence were more dangerous than any shout. "Find her," Conrad said. "I don't care what it takes. Find her before morning." 20 minutes later, Pritchard called. His voice was relaxed, confident, the voice of a man who believed he was holding a good card. "Conrad, it's been a while. I have someone here, one of Donovan Mercer's people. She's helping Mercer expand into my territory. But interestingly enough, she knows a great deal about you. A great deal. The restaurant system, the supply routes, the way the money flows. What do you want me to do with what she knows?" Conrad held the phone, and in that second, he wasn't the man sitting in the dark, reading old emails. He wasn't the abandoned husband drowning in regret. He was Conrad Voss, the boss who could speak and make a conference room of 3 families fall silent. His voice dropped, slowed, the kind of voice Briggs called the voice before the storm. The kind of voice everyone who had known Conrad long enough understood was the most dangerous warning sign. "Pritchard," Conrad said, each word separated, clear. "I'll say this once. You return her. You take the southern shipping route, the entire route. No negotiation, no added conditions. You return her, and you take the route. That's the best scenario for you." He paused. "You don't want to know the worst one." Silence on the line. Pritchard was seasoned. He had lived in the underworld long enough to know when a threat was real and when it was only a show of force. And Conrad's voice now wasn't a show. It was flat and heavy as a steel table, with no room for negotiation, no room for testing. "You'd trade the entire southern shipping route for a waitress?" Pritchard asked, his voice still trying to sound casual, though it had thinned by 1 layer. "Return her," Conrad said. Then he hung up. He set the phone down and looked at Briggs, who was standing in the doorway of the study. Briggs looked back, and in 10 years of working together, this was the first time he had seen something on Conrad's face that he couldn't name. "She isn't one of ours anymore," Briggs said softly, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. Conrad looked at him. "She was never mine," he said, and when he said those words, his voice no longer sounded like the voice of a boss. It sounded like the voice of a man who had just seen a truth he had been running from for a long time. "That's the problem. Go find her." Tessa was released less than 2 hours later. Pritchard, greedy as he was, wasn't stupid. The southern shipping route was worth millions of dollars, and it had taken years to build. and Conrad handed it over without hesitating for even 1 second. When a boss was willing to pay that high a price without hesitation, it meant the cost of not paying would be much higher. Pritchard understood that math. Conrad drove to the Western Industrial District. He parked at the end of the road, turned off the lights, and sat in the dark. Briggs and 2 others went inside. 10 minutes later, Tessa stepped out through the iron door of a warehouse. She walked on her own 2 feet, her back straight, her steps steady. But beneath the weak streetlight, Conrad saw her hands clench slightly at her sides, clench so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She wasn't injured, but she had been isolated for hours, with no phone, with no one knowing where she was. And that feeling, the feeling of completely disappearing from the world without anyone noticing, was the kind of thing that left a mark even when it never touched the skin. Briggs put Tessa into another car. She didn't look toward Conrad's car. Maybe she didn't know he was there. Maybe she knew and chose not to look. Conrad sat in the car, watching the vehicle carrying Tessa drive away, its red taillights shrinking into the night. Briggs came back, opened the car door, sat in the passenger seat, and said, "She's all right. Nothing happened to her." Conrad nodded, silent. Then he said, his voice very soft, almost speaking to himself more than to Briggs, "My mother once lived in a house she was never allowed to choose to leave. For 30 years, she stayed there until the day she died. No one called it anything. They just called it marriage." Briggs said nothing. There are sentences a listener knows he shouldn't answer. He sat quietly beside Conrad in the engine-off car, in the empty industrial district, and let that sentence rest in the air until it sank on its own, heavy and murky, like all the truths people take a lifetime to finally speak aloud. That night, after Briggs took her to a new rented room in another neighborhood, Tessa sat on the kitchen floor. Not on the bed, not in a chair, on the floor. Her back leaned against the kitchen cabinets, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around her shins, and she trembled. She hadn't trembled when she stood in front of Conrad's man outside the restaurant's back door. She hadn't trembled when she was held in the warehouse for hours, alone, without a phone, with no one knowing where she was. She had kept herself calm through all of those moments, because she had learned how to shut everything down when danger came. Shut fear down, shut pain down, shut down anything that could make her weak, and only open it again when she was safe. Now she was safe, and everything opened at once. She trembled because, for the first time since the night she left the mansion, she understood a truth she had been trying not to think about. She was truly alone. Not alone in the way of being alone in a motel, cooking for herself, going to work by herself. Alone in a deeper way. The kind of alone where there was no one in the world who would notice if she disappeared. Tonight, when she was held in that warehouse, if Briggs hadn't found her, if Conrad hadn't called Pritchard, how long would she have sat in there? Who would have looked for her? Who would have known? Hector at the restaurant would have thought she had quit without notice. The motel would have thought she had checked out. The suppliers she had contacted would have thought she had changed her mind. She would have vanished, and the world would have kept turning without even realizing one person was missing. She sat on the kitchen floor and trembled, and whispered, her voice so small only the wall could hear it. "I'm trying, Mom. I'm trying." No one answered. The kitchen floor was cold beneath her feet. The fluorescent light on the ceiling buzzed softly. Outside the window, Boston at night didn't know and didn't care that a 27-year-old woman was sitting on the floor of a cheap rented room, trembling, trying to keep herself from breaking open. Earlier, in the car, while Briggs was driving her away from the industrial district, he had driven in silence for 10 minutes. Tessa sat in the back seat, looking out through the window, saying nothing. Then Briggs spoke, his voice soft, not looking at her in the rearview mirror. He traded the southern shipping route. The entire route. No negotiation, no conditions. Tessa was silent for a long time. The southern shipping route. She knew that route. She knew how much it was worth, how many years it had taken to build, how important it was on Conrad's board of power, and he had given it away, without hesitation, without conditions, with only one sentence over the phone, in exchange for her. Not in exchange for the information she had, not in exchange for loyalty, only in exchange for her safety. "Tell him thank you," Tessa said, her voice flat. "And tell him not to contact me." Briggs nodded. He didn't ask why. He understood enough not to ask. The next morning, someone knocked on the door of the rented room. Tessa startled, because she hadn't given anyone the new address. She rose from the kitchen floor, where she had sat all night and somehow fallen asleep without knowing when, her shoulders stiff, her back aching. She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Outside stood a man she recognized at once, the head chef, the man who had worked for the Voss restaurant for 8 years before Celeste fired him. He stood outside the door in an old coat, carrying a brown paper bag, and his face carried the look of someone who didn't know what he should say but knew he should be here. Tessa opened the door. "I heard what happened," he said. He didn't explain who he had heard it from. He didn't need to. In this world, news traveled fast. "I don't know what to say, but I can cook." He stepped inside, didn't wait to be invited, went straight into the tiny kitchen of the rented room, set the paper bag on the counter, and took out eggs, butter, bread, a bunch of scallions, and a small container of seasoning he had brought from his own kitchen. He began to cook. Quick, neat, precise, with the hands of a man who had worked a professional kitchen for 20 years. The smell of butter melting in the hot pan spread through the small rented room, warm and familiar and so real that Tessa had to turn her face away for a moment because she didn't want anyone to see her eyes just then. He set the food on the table. 2 plates, even though he had only cooked for her. He sat across from her, didn't eat, just sat there so she wouldn't have to eat alone. Tessa ate, slowly, 1 bite at a time. This was the first meal in a very long time that someone had cooked for her. Since her mother died, she had always been the one cooking for other people. Cooking for Conrad, cooking for the staff, cooking for the system. No one had cooked for her. Until this morning, when she had nearly finished eating, he spoke, his voice low, his eyes lowered to the tabletop. "I'll follow you. Whatever you open, I'll follow." He lifted his eyes to her. "Not because I hate Mr. Voss, but because you were the first boss who remembered my child's name." Tessa set down her fork. She looked at him, this man who had driven across half the city early in the morning to cook her a meal, because he didn't know what to say but knew how to cook. She didn't say thank you because, in that moment, those words weren't enough. She only nodded, a slow, steady nod. The kind of nod from someone receiving a promise and making one in return. And on the other side of the city, Conrad was making a decision he told no one, except Briggs. He sent 2 men to watch the area where Tessa was working, not to watch her, but to make sure no one touched her again. No surveillance, no control, only protection, from a distance, in silence. Donovan found out within a week, because his men noticed strangers appearing around the south side. Donovan called Conrad. "Your men are in my territory. How should I understand that?" Conrad said, "They aren't watching her. I just want to make sure no one touches her again. When she's strong enough to protect herself, I'll pull them back." Donovan was silent for a few seconds. Then, "Fine, but if your men step over the line, I'll consider it an intrusion." "They won't step over," Conrad said. "I promise." And for the first time in his life, Conrad Voss protected someone without demanding possession. He kept her safe without keeping her. He stood far away and watched without stepping closer. Maybe it still wasn't love in its truest form, but it was the closest thing a man like him knew how to give. And for Tessa, though she didn't know it, that was enough. Warren Holt called Conrad one morning, without warning, without a greeting. Warren was the only person in the world who was allowed to call Conrad without needing a reason, because Warren was the only one who had stood beside Conrad before Conrad became anyone. Before the empire, before the family, before all of it, the 2 of them had once started together in a rented kitchen with nothing but their bare hands, and Warren was the only person who had known Conrad before he knew how to give orders to anyone. "I heard everything," Warren said, his voice neither angry nor pitying, only direct, the kind of directness that belongs to a man who has lived long enough not to sugarcoat anything. "I heard Tessa left, heard about Celeste, heard about the suppliers walking away, heard about Pritchard, heard you traded the southern shipping route. I heard all of it." Conrad said nothing. He held the phone, standing at the study window, looking out over the mansion garden, slowly going wild because there was no one left to tend it. "I'll say this once, so listen carefully," Warren continued. "You looked at that girl washing dishes and saw someone beneath you. You saw someone you saved. You saw someone who needed you. But you forgot one thing, Conrad. You forgot that you were once that person too. You washed dishes too. You once had nothing too. And you forgot, so you looked at her and didn't see that she was like you." Silence stretched across the line. Warren let it stay quiet long enough, then went on, his voice lower. You want to fight her the way you fight an enemy? You'll lose. Not because she's stronger than you, but because she isn't afraid to lose. She's already lost everything, Conrad. Lost her mother, lost her home, lost all of it. And she still got back on her feet. You've never really lost before. You don't know what loss is. And that difference, that's something you can't buy. Warren hung up. No goodbye. No well wishes. Just ended the call. Because Warren knew there were conversations that didn't need a graceful ending. They only needed the truth to remain after the line went dead. Conrad stood by the window for a long time after that call. Then his phone vibrated again. This time, it was Briggs. The council has called a meeting. This afternoon. Everyone will be there. The Allied Family Council met in a closed room on the upper floor of the Voss flagship restaurant. The restaurant Conrad himself had built. The place Tessa herself had run. Every chair was occupied. 4 family representatives, 2 financial advisors, and at the head of the table opposite Conrad, a 70-year-old man named Aldrich Kessler, the eldest, the one whose voice carried the most weight, the man who had been sitting at this table since Conrad's father was still alive. No one made small talk. No one poured wine. The air in the room was heavy in a way Conrad recognized the moment he walked in. Heavy in the way of something already decided and only waiting to be announced. The first to speak was the representative of the Whitmore family, the man who had raised his voice in the shipping route division meeting that Conrad had silenced with a single sentence. This time, he didn't raise his voice. He spoke slowly, word by word. Conrad, the clean business is collapsing. 3 main suppliers have left. Middle management is waiting to jump ship. The flagship restaurant has lost its head chef and 3 kitchen employees. Celeste is running the clean side, and she's destroying it faster than any rival could. He looked straight at Conrad. The council requires you to transfer operational control of the clean side to a person appointed by the council. Conrad sat still. He looked at every face around the table, one by one, faces he had worked with for more than a decade, people who had benefited from what he had built, people now sitting here telling him he was no longer enough. Then he stood, not to leave, to speak, because Conrad Voss didn't say important things while seated. 15 years ago, he said, his voice neither rising nor falling, perfectly controlled, even though something inside him was breaking apart piece by piece. When I sat in this chair, this organization controlled 2 shipping routes and 3 restaurants. Annual revenue was 1/10 of what we have now. Today, you sit in a room I built, on chairs I bought, drinking wine from a cellar where I chose every bottle, and you tell me I'm not capable enough. The room went silent. No one argued, not because they were afraid, because what Conrad said was true, and everyone in the room knew it. But Aldrich Kessler, the 70-year-old man who had watched this empire pass through 2 generations, wasn't crushed by that truth. He looked at Conrad, his eyes neither cold nor warm, only sad in the way of a man who had seen too many brilliant men burn themselves alive. No one has forgotten what you built, Conrad, he said. Not one person in this room has forgotten, but the man who builds a house must also know when the house needs another craftsman. He paused. Not because you're weak, but because you're tired, and tired men make mistakes. You've made many mistakes already, Conrad. You lost your best person, and you let someone who understands nothing replace her. That's not the decision of a healthy man. Conrad looked at Aldrich. This old man had once sat drinking coffee with his father every Sunday morning. He had known Conrad since Conrad was a boy, standing outside meeting room doors waiting for his father, and now he was looking at Conrad with eyes that said, I care about you, but I won't let caring about you drag everything else down. Conrad knew he had lost. He knew it from the moment he walked into the room, from the way everyone sat, from the avoiding eyes of people who had once supported him without condition. But Conrad Voss didn't kneel. Never had, never would. 48 hours, he said. His voice wasn't asking, wasn't pleading. It was the voice of a man standing upright in a storm, knowing the storm would win, but refusing to bow before it arrived. I built this with my own hands. Give me 48 hours before the council decides. Aldrich looked around the table, then back at Conrad. He nodded. 48 hours, he said. Don't do anything that makes this harder than it needs to be, Conrad. I won't, Conrad said. Then he walked out of the meeting room. Back straight, steps even, through the hallway of the restaurant he had built, past the walls he had chosen, past the tables where Tessa had once placed flowers every week. He walked straight outside, looking at no one, stopping for nothing. And when the restaurant door closed behind him, no one in the meeting room said anything for a long while, because even though they had just taken power from a man, they all knew that man had walked out the same way he had entered every room for the past 15 years, like someone who owned it. The restaurant sat on a quiet corner in Roslindale, not downtown Boston, not an upscale district, not the kind of place food magazines would discover on their own. 40 seats, 12 tables, one kitchen. Tessa signed the lease with money from the partnership agreement with Donovan, the first and only investment he placed in her hands, not because he trusted blindly, but because the 20 pages of analysis she had sent in that $8 envelope had convinced him this was a profitable deal. Donovan didn't do charity. He invested, and Tessa was the best investment he had found in 10 years. She designed everything herself. No interior designer, no design magazines for reference. She chose tables and chairs from liquidation warehouses, repaired them, repainted them, rearranged them until every table sat exactly where she wanted it. The kitchen, she let the head chef decide, because the kitchen was his territory, and Tessa knew that respecting someone else's territory was a better way to keep talented people than any salary. 2 former managers from the Voss system, the ones who had resigned right after Tessa left, now stood beside her, handling suppliers, reservations, legal matters, logistics. They didn't come because Tessa paid high wages. Donovan paid, but not above market. They came for the reason the head chef had spoken in the kitchen of that rented room that morning, because she remembered their children's names. The night before opening, everyone had gone home. The tables and chairs had been set. The kitchen was ready. The menu had been printed. The cups and dishes had been arranged. The whole small restaurant sat quiet in the pale yellow light, ready for tomorrow morning, for the first day, for everything that would come after. Tessa stayed behind alone. She sat down at table number 1, the table by the window, the table she had placed there because in the afternoon, the natural light fell into that exact corner, warm and soft, the kind of light that made the person sitting there feel held without feeling exposed. She had chosen the position for this table before all the others. She didn't know how to explain why. She only knew that when she set it down and watched the afternoon light touch the wood, it felt right. She opened her handbag and took out her mother's photograph. The photograph that had followed her from the Voss mansion to the first motel room, then to the second rented room, after the night Pritchard had held her. Then through every night she sat on the bed writing her plan. The edges of the photograph had curled slightly. One corner had faded a little. But her mother's smile in the picture was still the same. The smile of a woman standing in the backyard of a shabby rental house and smiling into the camera as if life held nothing to fear. Tessa placed the photograph on table number 1, leaning it against the small vase of flowers, and looked at her mother. "I did it, Mom," she said softly, just loud enough to hear in the empty room. "It's small, 40 chairs, but it's mine." She sat there a little longer, looking at her tiny restaurant, looking at the tables, the chairs, the kitchen, the glass front door where people would walk in tomorrow. She didn't cry. She had cried enough on the kitchen floor of the rented room the night after she was released. Now she didn't cry. She only sat and felt, and let this moment belong entirely to her, with no one watching, no one judging, no one defining it for her. Then she put her mother's photograph back into her bag, turned off the lights, locked the door, and went home. Opening night had no media. No red carpet, no VIP guest list. Only her team, the people who had followed her not because she was rich or powerful, but because she treated them the right way. The head chef stood in the kitchen, calm, precise, cooking as if he had been waiting his whole life to cook in this kitchen. The 2 former managers coordinated service, gentle, seamless, the kind of service guests didn't notice was happening. They only felt comfortable without knowing why. The longtime seafood supplier, the man who had left the Voss contract to work with Tessa, personally delivered the fresh ingredients that morning, arriving 20 minutes early because he wanted to make sure everything was perfect for her first night. Donovan Mercer sat at the inner corner table, silent, observing. He didn't interfere with anything. He had come to watch his investment operate, and what he saw made him nod only once, slowly, to himself. The nod of a man confirming he had been right. The restaurant was full on its first night. 40 seats, 40 guests. Not because of advertising, because Tessa didn't have money for advertising, but because of word of mouth, because people in Boston's restaurant industry knew who Tessa was, knew she had operated the Voss chain for 5 years, and when they heard she was opening her own place, They wanted to come see. The food was good. The service was good. And there was something in that small space that many larger restaurants didn't have. Something people could feel but had trouble naming. Something that happens when the person running a place doesn't just manage it, but truly cares. The news reached Conrad through Briggs. Neat, short, without adding or subtracting anything. Exactly Briggs's style. She opened the restaurant. 40 seats, fully booked. Conrad didn't ask more. That evening, he sat inside his flagship restaurant, the 200-seat restaurant he had built with 15 years of power and money. Half the room was empty. Tables without guests, chairs pulled out with no one sitting in them. And somewhere across the city, in a 40-seat restaurant on a quiet corner, the woman he had once called a waitress was standing in the kitchen, smiling, surrounded by people who had chosen to follow her not because of fear or money, but because she remembered their children's names. Celeste stood at the mansion's front door with her suitcase already in hand. It wasn't the suitcase she had brought the first time. The small one, just large enough for one night. This one was bigger, holding enough of what she had accumulated during her time under this roof. Clothes, shoes, a few things she had bought for herself. She stood straight, her hair neatly brushed, her makeup light, looking exactly like the day she had walked in, except for one thing, her eyes. The eyes of someone who had seen enough to know she needed to leave. Conrad stood in the hallway, a few steps away from her. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this coming for days. From the way Celeste had begun packing her things in the bedroom with quiet order, from the way she stopped asking him about future plans, from the way she looked at him every night with the eyes of someone calculating the right moment to withdraw. "I came here because you said this was an alliance," Celeste said. Her voice neither cold nor warm, only clear, the kind of clarity that came from someone who had weighed every word before speaking. "I thought you knew what you were doing. I accepted because I believed you were a man who could control everything." She paused. "But you don't know, Conrad. You're losing to a girl who has nothing in her hands except the truth. And I don't want to stand beside a man who is losing without seeing that he's losing." Conrad said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew Celeste was right, and arguing against a truth simply because it hurt was something he had already done too many times. Celeste pulled her suitcase across the threshold. She didn't look back, didn't apologize, didn't wish him luck. She stepped out into the afternoon light and walked toward the car waiting at the end of the driveway. Practical from the beginning, practical to the end. Conrad stood there watching her go and felt no anger, felt no loss, only the tired admission that Celeste had been a terrible decision he had made at a moment when he had mistaken emptiness for necessity. She wasn't the cause of anything. She was only the symptom. After Celeste left, the mansion became completely quiet. Quiet in the way only large houses can be quiet. The kind of quiet with weight, pressing down on every room, every hallway, every stair. Mrs. Martha was gone. The chef was gone. The cleaning staff had quit. Celeste was gone. And Tessa. Tessa had been gone for a long time already, but now, when there was no one else left, her absence truly filled every empty space. The 48 hours had run out. Conrad drove to the flagship restaurant, not to the meeting room upstairs where the council was waiting for the transfer papers, but to the kitchen. The kitchen was on the ground floor, in the back, where customers never saw it, but where everything truly began. 15 years ago, this kitchen had been nothing but a small rented room inside someone else's restaurant. Conrad and Warren had stood there, just the two of them. One kitchen, no men, no family, no system. Conrad washed dishes, Warren cooked. They had started from there, from the smell of grease and the sound of the ventilation fan, from 14-hour shifts and 4 hours of sleep, from empty hands and a dream no one but them believed could become real. Now Conrad sat on a stainless steel chair inside the empty kitchen of the flagship restaurant. The kitchen was closed. The staff had gone home. Only the old smell of grease remained, soaked into the walls, and the ventilation fan hummed steadily above him. He placed the transfer papers on the steel prep table where the chef usually chopped vegetables every morning, took out a pen, and signed. His hand didn't tremble. His signature was clear, even, exactly like every signature he had made on anything over the past 15 years. Conrad Voss wasn't a man whose hand shook when doing something difficult. He was simply a man who took a very long time to admit that the difficult thing needed to be done. He set the pen down, looked around the kitchen, looked at the brick walls, the ventilation fan, the steel table worn with knife marks after years of use. Then he stood, picked up the papers, and walked out. He went upstairs, through the hallway leading to the meeting room. As he passed a small room at the end of the hall, the room he had kept unchanged for years, his father's old office, the door was slightly open. He stopped, looked inside. On the wall was his father's photograph, the boss from the generation before him. Cold face, sharp eyes, a smile that never reached his eyes. The man who had ruled this empire before Conrad with fists and fear. The man who had kept everything and everyone under control until the very last day, including his own wife. Conrad looked at the photograph, and in his mind, one sentence appeared, as clear as printed words. You kept everything. No one cried when you died. He walked on. Didn't take the photograph down. Didn't say anything more. Just walked. Because some truths don't need an action attached to them. Being seen is enough. He walked down the hallway, the transfer papers in his hand, toward the meeting room where the council was waiting. And halfway down the hall, near the stairs, he came across a young kitchen employee heading off shift. The girl stopped when she realized who was walking toward her. Her eyes widened slightly, the eyes of someone unexpectedly meeting the big boss in a place she didn't expect, and she stood straight by instinct, both hands at her sides, as if she didn't know whether to speak or leave. Then she said, her voice small, almost shy, "Thank you for building this place." Conrad stopped, looked at her. A kitchen employee whose name he didn't know, whose length of time working here he didn't know, whose face he didn't know. One person among hundreds he had never stopped long enough to see. And she was thanking him, truly thanking him, in the lightly trembling voice of someone saying something she knew she might not have the chance to say a second time. He nodded, said nothing, not because of arrogance, but because, in that moment, he didn't trust his voice to stay calm if he opened his mouth. The employee walked away. Conrad remained in the hallway for a little longer, alone, holding the transfer papers, feeling their weight as something far heavier than the number of pages inside. Then he drew a breath, straightened his back, and walked into the meeting room. He placed the papers on the table, in front of Aldrich Kessler. Aldrich looked at him, looked at the papers, then looked back at him. No one in the room said anything. Conrad nodded once, to Aldrich, to the whole room, then turned and walked out, back straight, steps even. Exactly the way he had walked into every room for the past 15 years. Because even though Conrad Voss had lost control, lost his empire, lost almost everything, there was one thing he still kept as he stepped through that door, and that was the way he walked. The mansion was placed on the asset restructuring list the following week. Conrad had 3 weeks to move out. He didn't hire help. He packed the boxes himself, sorted everything himself, decided for himself what to keep and what to throw away. He threw most of it away. Most of the things in the mansion were things Tessa had chosen, from the living room sofa, to the porcelain dishes in the kitchen, to the books on the shelves that she had placed there, because she knew the afternoon light looked beautiful when it fell across them. He didn't want to take those things with him, not because he hated them, but because every item reminded him of something he didn't want to forget, yet couldn't bear to remember every day. While packing, he opened the kitchen drawer, the third drawer on the left, beside the tea box, exactly where Mrs. Martha had described. The diabetes medicine was still there. Tessa had kept it there for Mrs. Martha, checked it every month, never told anyone. Mrs. Martha was gone now. The medicine remained. Conrad picked up the bottle, looked at it, then placed it back exactly where it had been, because he didn't know what else to do with it except leave it resting in the place where someone had once cared enough to put it there. 1 week before the moving deadline, Conrad's lawyer, David Park, called and told him to come to the office. David was the man Tessa had introduced to Conrad. Through a trusted source, David refused to name, even though they both knew who that source was. David was good, specializing in restructuring and asset protection, and he had helped Conrad move through the transfer process with the least possible personal damage. Conrad arrived at David's office in the morning. David sat behind his desk, and in front of him was a small package, a brown paper box with no shipping label, no sender's name. David pushed the box toward Conrad. "This arrived at my office this morning," David said. "For you." Conrad looked at the box. "Who sent it?" David looked at him. He didn't answer that question, because they both knew. Instead, he said, "She sent it through me, because she knew you wouldn't accept it if she sent it directly." Conrad opened the box. Inside were two things: a small brass key, ordinary, the kind of key people use for a rented apartment, and a white card, small enough to fit in his palm, unsigned. On the card, there was only one handwritten line, the small, even handwriting so familiar that Conrad recognized it at once, even when he tried not to. 3rd floor, East Unit, the kitchen gets morning sun. Conrad held the key in his hand, small, light, cold. He looked at it for a very long time. David added softly, "The lease has been paid for 12 months. I checked. The apartment is in Somerville. Quiet building, 3rd floor." Conrad understood, and that understanding came slowly, heavily, like water soaking through a wall. Tessa had prepared this apartment before the transfer process was over, before he signed the papers in the restaurant kitchen, before the council officially voted, meaning that while she was building the thing that would replace his empire, while she was pulling suppliers, pulling personnel, pulling partners out of the Voss system, while she was doing all of that, she had stopped and made sure he had somewhere to fall. She had found an apartment, checked whether the kitchen had morning sunlight, paid 12 months of rent, and sent the key through a lawyer so he wouldn't have to endure the humiliation of receiving it directly from her hand. She brought down his empire and, at the same time, made sure he didn't hit the ground. Conrad slipped the key into his coat pocket, nodded at David, stood and walked out without saying anything more, because there wasn't a word among all the words he knew that was enough for this. A few days later, Conrad moved into the small apartment in Somerville, and one afternoon, he walked, with no destination, just walked, because the mansion was gone, the car had been sold, the empire had been transferred, and walking was the only thing he could do without needing anyone's permission. He passed many streets, turned many corners, didn't think much, only kept moving. Then he stopped. In front of him was a small restaurant on a quiet corner, 40 seats. The glass front revealed the inside, neat tables and chairs, warm yellow light, and in the kitchen, visible through the service window, Tessa stood talking to the head chef. She was smiling, a smile Conrad recognized immediately, not because he had seen it many times, but because he had never seen it before. In the 5 years he had lived with her, he had never seen Tessa smile like that. It was the smile of someone standing exactly where she belonged. Tessa looked out, saw him through the glass door. She stopped for 1 second, then stepped outside. The two of them stood on the sidewalk, a few steps apart, in the ordinary afternoon of an ordinary Boston street. "The restaurant is beautiful," Conrad said. "Thank you," Tessa said. Silence. Not long, but long enough for both of them to hear the cars passing on the street and the light wind moving beneath the awning. "I read your restaurant proposal email," Conrad said. "The one you sent 2 years ago? 14 pages. Tessa looked at him. "You never opened it." "I know." Silence again. This time, longer. "Did you get the key?" Tessa asked. "Yes. The kitchen gets morning sun. I thought you needed a place with sunlight." Conrad looked at her. Looked at the face he had seen every day for 5 years, and had never truly seen. Looked into the eyes he had once thought were quiet, but now understood had never been quiet at all. They had always been full. He simply hadn't looked carefully enough to read them. "Do you hate me?" he asked. The question came out before he could stop it, his voice smaller than he wanted, more honest than he had intended. Tessa looked at him for a long time, not because she was searching for an answer. She had had the answer for a long time. She looked because she wanted to make sure that when she spoke, he would truly hear her. "I don't hate you, Conrad," she said. "I just regret that you never opened the email." That sentence fell into the space between them and stayed there, heavy and quiet, not like an accusation, not like forgiveness, like a truth, the simplest and most painful truth one person can tell another. "I was here. I sent you the best thing I had, and you didn't open it." Tessa turned and walked back into the restaurant. She didn't look back. Conrad stood on the sidewalk, watched her pass through the glass door, return to the kitchen, return to her work, return to the life she had built herself with her cracked hands and 47 pages of planning and $8 of printing money. And he understood, more clearly than at any other moment in his life, that Tessa had taken nothing from him. She hadn't stolen the empire, hadn't destroyed his career, hadn't taken revenge. She had only taken herself back, taken back the 5 years she had given away, and received nothing in return except one, come home early, and a silver bracelet on another woman's wrist. He stood on that sidewalk for a very long time. Then he turned and walked toward the small apartment in Somerville, the one with the east-facing kitchen and morning sun. And every step he took on the sidewalk that afternoon was heavier than the one before. Not because he was tired, but because he was carrying the weight of understanding, the heaviest thing a person can carry, because it always comes after the moment when it should have been there. The third-floor apartment, the East Unit, was exactly as the card had said. Conrad moved in one morning with very little, a few cardboard boxes, just enough clothes, his laptop, and the paper notebook he had bought at the corner grocery store on the way there. The apartment was small, one bedroom, one kitchen, one living room, just large enough for a desk beside the window. No long marble hallways, no private study with his father's photograph on the wall, no large kitchen with the coffee machine someone had once turned on every morning. But the kitchen had morning sun, exactly as Tessa had said. Conrad stood at the kitchen window at 7 o'clock in the morning, the first light coming through the glass, warm and golden, spilling across the empty kitchen counter. He made his own coffee. It wasn't the first time. He had been practicing since the day Tessa left. But this was the first time he had made coffee in a place he hadn't built, didn't own, didn't control. A place someone had chosen for him, not because he deserved it, but because that person refused to become the cruel version of him. He drank his coffee standing by the window, looking down at the street. Pedestrians, bicycles, a woman pushing a stroller, 2 workers unloading goods from a truck. Ordinary life. The life he had spent the past 15 years looking down on from above, through the windows of black cars, through the fences of the mansion, through the distance power had created between him and everyone else. Now he stood on the 3rd floor, close enough to hear people talking on the street below, low enough to see their faces clearly. And he felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Small, not small in the sense of being diminished, small in the sense of being the right size, the true size of a human being when he stops pretending he is larger than he really is. He sat down at the desk beside the window, opened the paper notebook, not the laptop, not a spreadsheet, not the management system of an empire, a paper notebook, hardcover, blank pages. Like the notebook he had used 15 years earlier to write his first business plan by hand, in a cramped rented room, when he was no one yet and everything still lay ahead of him. He held the pen, looked at the blank page, and wrote one single line. Open the email. 3 words. Literally, read what other people send you. Figuratively, see what is right in front of you. Learn how to pay attention. Learn how to stop. Learn how to look at a human being and see that human being. Not the role you assign to them, not the function they serve, not what you want them to be, but what they truly are. He looked at those 3 words on the page, didn't write more, didn't rush. For the first time in 15 years, Conrad Voss sat before a question and didn't hurry to answer it, because he was beginning to understand that rushing to answer was how he had lived, how he had lost everything, how he had looked at Tessa sitting across from him every night for 5 years, and not once truly seen her. On the other side of the city, that same morning, Tessa Marlowe walked into her restaurant at 8 o'clock, before everyone else, as she did every day. She made coffee for herself, sat at table number 1 by the window, and read through the day's task list. Then her team began to arrive. The head chef came into the kitchen, turned on the oven, checked the ingredients, and began preparing. The 2 former managers from the Voss system walked in, set down their bags, opened their laptops, and began checking the reservations. 3 new employees Tessa had hired over the past month, all of them people who had been underestimated at their old jobs, people who had been overlooked, people who hadn't been listened to, people with ability but no opportunity. Once everyone had arrived, Tessa stood. She looked at the 2 former managers, the ones who had resigned from the Voss system right after she left, the ones Celeste had considered unimportant, the ones who had been pushed aside because they dared speak up about problems no one wanted to hear. You told the truth at the old place, Tessa said, her voice calm but clear. You said the things that needed to be said, and you were punished for it. Here, I want to make one thing clear. Telling the truth isn't causing trouble. It's doing the right thing. And here, people who do the right thing get to stay. The 2 managers looked at her, nodded. Nothing more needed to be said, because some promises don't need contracts. They only need to be spoken by someone who has already proven through action that they keep their word. Tessa sat down, opened her notebook, and turned to a new page. The team returned to their stations and began the workday. And in the quiet moment before the restaurant opened, as the kitchen began to fill with the sound of knives striking cutting boards and the smell of butter melting in a hot pan drifting out from the back, Tessa remembered a voice, her mother's voice, soft and clear, from a long time ago, from an afternoon she had almost forgotten but had never truly forgotten. Work will keep you standing if you let it. Don't be afraid that it's bigger than you. Just begin. Tessa looked at her team, looked at her small 40-seat restaurant, 12 tables, 1 kitchen, looked at the morning sunlight pouring through the glass door, and she said, just loud enough to be heard, just steady enough to be certain, all right, let's begin. And that wasn't an ending, because Tessa Marlowe didn't work with endings. She worked with beginnings, with mornings, with new pages, with people who came and chose to stay not because they were afraid, but because they believed. And her story, the story of the waitress who walked out of a boss's mansion with 1 handbag and $4,700, taught us something that books and money and power can never teach. That true strength doesn't lie in how much you can hold on to. It lies in being able to stand back up when you have nothing left, in the kindness you still give, even to those who failed you, in the courage to begin again when the world believes you are finished. Never look at someone through what they have. Look at them through what they are willing to do when they have lost everything, because sometimes the person sitting beside you every day is the most extraordinary person you have ever met. And if you don't stop long enough to look, one day you'll wake up in an empty room, staring at an unopened email, and realize you lost the most precious thing without ever knowing it. If this story touched you, please hit the like button to support us. Share this video with the people you think need to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the new stories we share every day. How did this story make you feel? Leave a comment below and share the feelings deep in your heart. We're always listening, and we truly treasure every comment you send us. Thank you for staying with us until the very last minute. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every single day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.